Show 13 of NBC's Saturday Night is another largely inconsequential one, if we're honest. There are no classic sketches and an abundance of repeated material, and the host is serviceable but adds little to most of his scenes. I certainly don't mean to put you off from what's to come, loyal viewers, but it's my opinion that the second half of Season 1 suffers from some of the least enjoyable or interesting hosts of the show's first 5 years. It's as if Lauren front-loaded the year with all the headline grabbers whose shows stand the test of time in the first few weeks, with the remaining shows content to pick from flavors of the month like Louise Lasser or showbiz stalwarts like Desi Arnaz. It would be the next season before we got another solid run of hosts, but there are still occasional flashes of brilliance from the cast, regardless of the unevenness. Peter Boyle was a character actor, probably remembered by folks these days for his long-running portrayal of Frank Barone, Ray's dad on the sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond. When he hosted SNL in 1976, though, Boyle was best known for two very different roles. The first was as the titular character in the 1970 movie Joe, a dramatic role which saw him play a violent and bigoted conservative factory worker who murders hippies. Boyle had been so disgusted by audiences' glorification and admiration of the character that he turned down some later parts in similarly violent films. The second and more pertinent role to his hosting gig, though, was as the monster in Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein. It was an enormously popular film among comedy nerds and the youth, which is pretty much SNL's core audience. Boyle had been a member of Second City in Chicago as well, which gave him more or less instant credibility with Lauren and the staff. And you know what? He does fine. Watching these all in a row the way I have been, the dips in quality become more apparent, but if I'd tuned in on this Valentine's Day in February of 1976, I don't think I'd have been disappointed. Boyle starts off with a silly bit in place of a proper monologue where he sings My Funny Valentine to his fiancée, who's his actual fiancée, by the way, and she starts making out with the guy in the seat next to her during the song. Just as Peter reaches the crescendo, she takes off with the fella. It's pretty cute and definitely avoids Boyle having to bother with a comedic monologue. The rest of the episode would see him mostly play straight man for the cast, but he doesn't come off as entertaining in that part as, say, Buck Henry does. There's really only one big misstep in the episode, though, and I get the feeling it wasn't something Boyle went along with overly willingly. More on that later. Boyle introduces music guest Al Jarreau as a Valentine for your ears, and he's not entirely wrong about that. His voice is an incredibly sensual instrument, and he does some pretty wild things with it. Jarreau got his start as a jazz singer and had apparently worked in nightclubs alongside John Belushi in the late 60s. He released a critically acclaimed album in 1975, We Got By, which shot into prominence. It's on the back of that release that Al appears here, and he performs the title track from that album as well as a cover of Sly and the Family Stone's Somebody's Watching You from Al's upcoming album Glow. There's some interesting camera work here, incidentally, but I'm unsure whether it was the idea of Jarreau or director Dave Wilson. Either way, it certainly livened up the visuals in a very 70s way, and I like it. This week's phone opening introduced me to The Butterfly Flick, which is apparently like a butterfly kiss, but not on your eyelashes.
Good evening, I'm Chevy Chase, and you are nothing.
The coke is kicked in, guys. Look out. Chevy does another held nose location report from the Patty Hearst trial, complete with equally absurd artist renderings. This time it's fine art paintings instead of line doodles. We get an overly long, extremely in-depth rundown of Dorothy Hamill's Olympic routine. Then Chevy tells us President Ford was heard to comment, "Big deal, I did that getting out of my car this morning." They just never tired of the Ford is clumsy jokes, and I love it. Garrett is an Olympic sports reporter. They seem to be having technical issues. He's late coming in, and the blue screen behind him hasn't been rigged to show the proper snowy background. One of the few blatant technical errors so far this season, apart from the WNBC ad miscue, which is pretty impressive for a live program in the 70s, if you ask me. Anyway, Garrett finally hits his mark and delivers an eloquent report on the Olympics, only to have Chevy point out that they've actually been over for a few days now. Garrett then gets angry like,
"Hey man, what do you want me to do, man? Man, what do I know about skiing and snow, Chevy? And all this bull gravy, baby. I could have been covering the Globetrotters in Angola, honky."
This is kind of an old joke at this point that black people don't like cold weather, but it's funny. Wow. Chevy starts off a segment by saying Ronald Reagan claims he has been wrongfully maligned by the press, then proceeds to describe him as
The washed-up 65-year-old ex-actor who looks almost too pretty for a man his age, and who was bland at best in some of the most violent, sexist movies ever made.
And
simply ignorant on foreign affairs and fiscal matters, and a fatuous cowpoke as a public leader.
Oh, and silly as well. Not too shabby. The show pulled absolutely no punches in its disdain for Reagan, and they'd soon be treated to a long decade called the 80s to ruminate on that disdain. Another report from Lorraine at the Blaine. She's reporting on a maker of snuff films, or maybe autopsy films, and she seems to be in great danger in doing so. Get out of there, Lorraine! Emily Latella is on about money being wasted on canker research. This terrible joke has somehow swung back around to become funny again, as I think happens sometimes with recurring SNL bits. They start off sort of meh, then through sheer bloody-minded sticking with them, they become tolerable, almost as if they'd just willed them to become funny. The jokes haven't really changed, but somehow they're funnier. I think maybe I just like Gilda, though. They end with what I think is a retread of the baby animal crushed to death news item from one of the very first shows. Yep, exact same punchline. This has been a pretty lazy episode as far as repeating themselves. They also re-aired several pre-taped pieces. Gary Wise has a short pre-taped piece of young black children saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and it ends on Garrett portraying Reuben Carter reciting the line, "And justice for all." I have to admit I didn't get the Carter illusion the first time I watched it and was puzzled by Garrett's attire. It's a moving and genuine sentiment, and the crowd responds to it. Still, though, we've had not a single laugh-out-loud funny moment from one of Gary Wise's films so far. I mean, somebody sort of had to do this joke, didn't they? It's a literal movie of a home. Hardy-har frickin' har, right? Imagine getting out a camera and film and going through the effort of making this and mailing it across the country. Now imagine, to your utter gobsmacked amazement, that it actually got aired. This guy must have been both puzzled and elated, and I hope he enjoyed seeing his work on network TV. The silly git. We find ourselves in Chicago on Valentine's Day in the year 1929 for the cold open. If that date doesn't mean anything to you, as it didn't to me, let me save you the trouble of going to Wikipedia. There was a famous gangland mass slaying that day, a product of a turf war between Irish and Italian mobsters. Anyway, Danny and Lorraine play wealthy socialites dining at a restaurant in the warehouse district, and they notice that it's begun to snow outside. They ask valet Chevy to go move their car to the indoor parking garage, and Chevy, of course, manages to find himself in the middle of the above-mentioned massacre. Stricken, Chevy stumbles back down the stairs, topples over the banister, flops over their table, deftly dropping Danny his car keys, I might add, then collapses to the floor.
Thank you. Live from New York, it's Saturday Night!
This one's cute, and the falls are impressive, and I suppose I can overlook the fact that the actual Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 took place at 10 in the morning when folks wouldn't be eating in a fancy restaurant like this. In this takeoff on the famous Corinthian Leather Chrysler ad starring Ricardo Montalban, which were very current at the time, Danny is a Spaniard. It's an effective parody.
When I choose a car with spirit, a car that will meet my every need. The Corrida is such a car.
And Danny's cute as the Montalban stand-in. Boyle is the judge in Samurai Divorce Court. Jane plays John's beleaguered wife as he seeks a divorce. This sketch is exactly what I just laid out and hits all the beats you'd expect. Belushi is just really good in these. They're very silly, but he plays the sword bits well. He mimes adultery with his sword, for instance, and it gets a good laugh. Boyle, however, is utterly inconsequential. This straight man role could have easily been played by George Coe or anybody else. He's not exactly doing much to distinguish himself. Jane's sword absolutely refuses to go back in her scabbard, which would have to suck on live TV. She holds it just out of frame, gamely trying to continue the scene until she's supposed to use the sword again. She's such a pro. It also took her 2 good hacks to break the desk apart towards the end of the skit. She's always having trouble with props not cooperating when she attempts violence on them. Remember that vase she chunked at the wall that wouldn't break? The ending freeze frame is pretty good, but this is probably the weakest samurai sketch so far. The dynamic worked best with just Futaba and Buck Henry in the scene, if you ask me. In what is absolutely the biggest misstep of the evening, Boyle introduces the Shapiro sisters, some preteen girls whom he strongly insinuates he was stalking before the show. The sisters were the children of Ken Shapiro, a director who'd worked with Chevy Chase and SNL warm-up comic Richard Belzer. In the outro, Don Pardo mentions that they have an album on Capitol Records, but no such disc was ever released. Perhaps this was some sort of friendly arrangement to get them publicity for a record deal that never happened, or maybe he just volunteered his kids to be the butt of some sick joke in exchange for them getting to be on TV. My research didn't turn up anything concrete as to why this thing came to pass, but I don't care for the joke that Peter is attracted to them, and I got the strong feeling Peter didn't care for it either. I blame Michael O'Donoghue, naturally. The similar, later Uncle Roy sketches were at least somewhat better in that they seemed somehow less exploitative in their take on the unsavory subject, not featuring actual children. This definitely gets the coveted worst award thing. Here we have hippies Lorraine and Danny rocking out to Inagata Davida. Boyle arrives with a misdelivered package from Bolivia which is leaking baby powder. Last week they got one that had Afghani AstroTurf. They're getting drugs in the mail, see, that's the joke. The two of them have dropped acid, and they proceed to sit with Boyle and watch slides of themselves doing random banal shit like eating cake or touching the window and explaining to the very sober straight man all the cool trippy shit that's happening in the slides. It's 70s drug humor in the vein of Cheech and Chong, only slightly edgier. Lorraine even suggests the number 3 or even the number 4 with clueless Boyle and his old lady. Risque, I guess. Boyle is, again, a non-factor here. He's good at playing dumb, which is something, I guess. The ending to this one is kinda weak, though. Boyle reveals he's an apparently clueless parole officer, and Danny hurriedly kicks him out of the house. Scene. At least hold on to the coat, Danny. Jeez. Speaking of terrible jokes getting funnier, as we were earlier, we have the Bees, Belushi and Boyle, versus the Wasps, in the white Anglo-Saxon people sense of the word, portrayed by Gilda and who else? Chevy. Chevy's jacket and turtleneck combo make me want to suplex him, that's for sure. Boyle gets the honor of picking Gilda up and spinning her around over his head, which is good for him. Danny is fun as the announcer in this one, but it's otherwise just a bunch of pretty pointless yelling. It ends with a cold exit, a literal cow drop on the stage. Who says a sketch needs an end, huh, Monty Python? After a whole one interview segment hosted by somebody else, Jane is back in the chair interviewing Mr. X, who is rather obviously Richard Nixon in a monkey mask. I have to say I don't really get the point of this one, other than just maybe morbid curiosity over what Nixon would have been up to at this point in his post-presidency. Apparently the joke is that Mr. X is seriously considering retiring to China to find himself spiritually. An interesting idea for Nixon. Danny plays a great dick, but the mask makes it tough to hear some of his lines. This is another silly sketch, but there was probably something cathartic about taking a swing at Nixon in '76, however juvenile it might have seemed. A dippy takeoff on Dueling Banjos, where Boyle and Belushi take it in turns doing their best comedy Brando impersonations along to that famous tune. They're both suitably over-the-top Marlins, not an ounce of subtlety between them, and it's good fun. This is probably a highlight of the episode for me, but honestly, even it's not that wonderful. In a takeoff on popular household product Janitor in a Drum, Jane's cheating on Boyle with Belushi, the janitor in the fridge. And Aykroyd, the doorman in the closet. And Mailman and a Maid, which is just Chevy and Gilda making out in the pantry. Look, this is a silly, sexist, salacious in the 70s skit, but it's cute. Garrett is milkman in the bedroom, and Jane seems to like him the best. Seems like poor Peter might be the only one not getting laid, which was probably true backstage that week as well. Finally, Lorraine gets to be lady next door, the picker-up for bored husbands. Maybe Boyle has a chance after all. I like Lorraine's nightie, by the way. Garrett gives Gilda a Valentine, and it's a little awkward. See, she didn't want Garrett to get the wrong idea, because Gilda only likes him as a friend. Garrett assures her, though, that his intentions are platonic, then proceeds to read his friend a graphically lascivious, though not very well written, love poem. Awkward. Garrett gets to introduce Al's second song, though, so I guess it's okay they made him out to be a creepy stalker. Jeez, poor Garrett. We We get a re-airing of the Gary Weiss Homeward Bound film to close the show. It's still saccharine, but still touching as well. Good close to a show on a night when it's okay to be a little sappy, and something the show was less willing to do as it got older. Boyle makes a pretty lame joke during the closing where he calls out his good friend who came all the way from San Francisco, then cuts to a Patty Hearst lookalike in the crowd. Hearst's trial was underway there at the time, you see. Get it? I had to look up this reference, I'm afraid, but there you go. This was a nice enough show, I guess, other than the Shapiro's sisters bit, which I found to be in poor taste, even for O'Donoghue. Even if you don't count the terrible conceit of that piece against it, it still had no business being on the show. Regardless, everyone seemed to get along well enough and enjoy themselves. They all joined Boyle on stage for the credits along with the sisters. Somebody keep Boyle away from those girls, for God's sake. John plants a big dramatic kiss on Gilda and then drops her off the damn stage at the end for a laugh. Happy Valentine's Day, Gilda. Next week's episode was hosted by Desi Arnaz, who had some initial clashes with the kids in the cast and crew, but ended up being a pretty go-with-the-flow kind of guest who trusted them to put him in some pretty funny sketches. It's not bad, and at the very least, it's stranger and more interesting to talk about than this week's installment. Stay tuned.